50% clinical, and 50% of my time is spent at the Center for Health Security, which is a think tank focused on pandemics, emerging infectious disease, and the intersection of infectious disease and national security. So in this talk, I'm going to kind of give you an overview of that topic and why it's important. And I think it's very important for trainees to understand this because you live in this world where these threats are not going anywhere, and they're only getting worse. And you've all just been through COVID, so I think you all understand the importance of pandemic preparedness and being cognizant of emerging biothreats, especially being here in the biggest city in the United States, which is very cosmopolitan, which anything can walk in the door of your emergency department at any time. So I'm going to start with just the concept of health security. And I think this is important to ground what we're talking about. What health security refers to is the activities required, both proactive, and I emphasize proactive, and reactive, to minimize the danger and impact of acute public health events that endanger people's health across geographical regions and international boundaries. So pandemic influenza, COVID, nuclear disasters, all of those types of things are health security threats. And that's the space where I focus. And I think about health security as part of kind of an ecosystem of biosecurity, which would be biological threats, pandemic preparedness, threats from avian influenza, threats from COVID, threats from novel viruses, emerging infectious diseases, so things like Zika, things like Oropouche virus, things like anaplasmosis, for example. And it all kind of fits into a rubric where you're trying to be prepared for all hazards. And when I say all hazards, that even means weather emergencies as well kind of fit into health security. And we're standing here in New York City where you had Superstorm Sandy, where you had to evacuate hospitals in Brooklyn, in Manhattan. The more prepared you are for those types of things, the more prepared you're going to be for any type of threat that the population might face. And there's actually data that shows that places that are very good at snow removal are also very good at influenza vaccination. So everything kind of synergizes together when you're talking about public health emergency preparedness. And health security kind of evolves from biosecurity. And biosecurity traditionally was really concerned with the threat of biological weapons use. And it really basically started in its heyday during the Clinton administration, after a lot of revelations that the Soviet Union had a clandestine biological weapons program that was operating for decades, even though the Soviet Union was a signatory to the Biological Weapons Convention. And after the Clinton administration, September 11th came. This is not anything new to people in New York City, but afterwards the Amerithrax attacks occurred, where there were 22 cases of anthrax with 5 deaths, all sent through the US Postal Service, which really galvanized people's determination to make the United States more resilient to infectious disease threats. And from there came a major program called Project BioShield, which is responsible for the anthrax countermeasures we have, the smallpox countermeasures we have, the plague countermeasures we have, even the Ebola countermeasures we have, all came from that. But on the right, I have the first kind of nod to biosecurity. It probably doesn't project very well, but this is a letter to the Continental Congress from George Washington. And in it, he is talking about the threat of British soldiers spreading smallpox amongst the Revolutionary Army. And he is going to ask for the inoculation of the soldiers in the Continental Army to protect against that. So this is the first George W. actually taking action against a biological threat. So this is I think, something that we've always dealt with. And the first use of biological weapons goes back into BC times. But most people's introductions to biosecurity came from these letters. And you can see there, it's not white powder, it's actually brownish looking. But these are some of the letters that were mailed, or one of the letters that was mailed after September 11th. And as I told you, the Soviet Union was really one of the impetuses for development of a program in the United States. And that's because they had this clandestine program. And I've got some books here that people might be interested in. But what happened was, nobody really knew what was going on in the Soviet Union. And then in 1979, there was an outbreak of anthrax that occurred in a civilian population. The Soviets said that this was due to an animal outbreak from contaminated meat. But the story didn't quite fit And it took some time to understand that this was actually from a clandestine military biological weapons factory where the filter malfunctioned. It wasn't put back in place, and a plume of anthrax went over the city and killed dozens of people. American investigators eventually went there. The Soviets said, as I said, an animal outbreak. Eventually, when Boris Yeltsin became the president of Russia, they admitted that this was a biological weapons program, a clandestine factory. Since that time, Vladimir Putin has disavowed Yeltsin's admission of that, but this was one of the major turning points, that this was a real threat. The biological weapons were still an active threat that people had to worry about. But interestingly, the biggest biological weapons attack in the United States occurred in 1984 from a domestic group called the Rajneeshis. This was a religious cult based in Oregon who were having problems with the local authorities. They wanted to influence the local election. So what they did, at that time you would find a catalog and you could order salmonella. You could probably still order salmonella. They used a catalog, ordered it, took it and sprinkled it on restaurant salad bars and poisoned 750 people, 40 people hospitalized, no one died. The CDC went and investigated this. They thought this was poor food handling practices at restaurants. And that really underscores something about a biological weapons attack, that you sometimes can't distinguish it from a natural outbreak. And even the CDC couldn't figure it out until two cultists were eventually arrested and confessed to doing this along with a whole bunch of other things. But this was the biggest biological attack on US soil. There are definitely a lot of modern incidents that have conditioned how we think about biological weapons. There's a picture of Secretary of State Colin Powell holding up a vial of something that looks like anthrax. And that's because we know that during the Iran-Iraq War, Iraq unleashed multiple chemical weapons against the Iranians, as well as the fact that they had a very aggressive biological weapons program leading up to the first Gulf War. And it was led by someone named Dr. Germ. And these things used to be familiar to people in the early 2000s because we were looking for a lot of these people during the Operation Iraqi Freedom. But Dr. Germ is a British-educated Iraqi microbiologist who was considered by the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, one of the most dangerous women in the world. And she had admitted to growing 19,000 liters of botulism toxin, 8,000 liters of anthrax, aflatoxins, Clostridium perfringens, ricin. She was found to be, she was surrendered by coalition forces and eventually was released without charge. I know people who have debriefed her and they have told me that she's very nice in person. Another one is Chemical Ali, who was in charge of the military. He was Saddam's first cousin, and he was the one in charge of the chemical brigades of the Iraqi military. He was tried and executed, and this is his playing card. U.S. soldiers used to carry the playing cards of some of the people they were looking for in Iraq. Another interesting figure there is Chemical Sally, or Mrs. Anthrax, is what she was known colloquially as. This is an interesting story because she was actually educated in the United States, and this really tells you about kind of dual-use concerns, that when people become microbiologists, they could do that for good or evil, just like any profession. You could be doing it for good causes or bad causes, and set up a front group called the Iraqi Microbiology Society, eventually found in Baghdad, taken into custody and released, and there's her playing card. But the point here is that there was this major effort to develop biological weapons by certain states, following the example of the Soviet Union. Even terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda tried to develop a biological weapons program. And this is a sketch that was confiscated or found in Afghanistan of a rudimentary lab. And at that time, Al-Qaeda's number 2, who then became the number 1 and who's since been killed, was a physician, Ayman al-Zawahiri. So there were efforts to develop biological weapons by terrorist groups as well. And the Al-Qaeda biological weapons expert was captured by Israel. In modern times, we actually have other threats that have kind of have emerged. So we know, for example, in North Korea, that Kim Jong-un, the dictator in North Korea, has no qualms about using chemical weapons. He used VX nerve on one of his relatives in the Kuala Lumpur airport. So that's a very toxic nerve agent. And we know that they are gaining biotech expertise and buying fermenters. So North Korea is another area where we think biological weapons might be proliferating. And you really can't talk about biological weapons and chemical weapons without talking about Russia. We've seen that there's been no qualms about using multiple different types of chemical agents on people all over the world, including on United Kingdom soil. For example, using advanced nerve agents to kill people as tools of assassins. radiation poisoning, and there's this rhetoric that you hear sometimes from Putin talking about developing weapons based on genetic principles. Nobody really knows exactly what that means, but it likely means biological weapons. In the non-classified U.S. State Department report on on countries' adherence to the Biological Weapons Convention, you can see that there are multiple findings there. So the Russian Federation, for example, they believe that they possess biological weapons. The People's Republic of China, they assume that they may have biological weapons. The Islamic Republic of Iran, and the Democratic Republic of Korea or North Korea, these are all states that we worry about biological weapons. And so this is not a threat that has gone away, and it's really important to keep that in mind, that it's been 22 years or 23 years since 24 years since the anthrax attacks. It's still something that's a viable threat. And this is sort of what the government was responding to when they had programs like Project BioShield, which was a $5.6 billion special reserve fund. And what they were doing was they recognized that when you're thinking about making a vaccine for plague, there's not a commercial market for that, or a monoclonal antibody for anthrax, not a commercial market for that. These are basically national security needs, and that's what Project BioShield was about, was looking at this from a national security angle and recognizing that normal pharmaceutical and biotech companies are not going to find this attractive because it's uncertain, and it's an uncertain and low profit market. That's why BioShield came about. And that's a picture of President Bush there and the CDC director at the time, Julie Gerberding, as well as a bipartisan group of lawmakers who signed Project BioShield into law. And that led to other organizations like BARDA, which is the Biomedical Advanced Research Development Agency or Authority, which basically has led to 100 drugs being approved or diagnostics being approved for these threat agents, whether they're biological, chemical, or nuclear. So many of the things that you saw, for example, with COVID, a lot of it was funneled through BARDA. I'm going to move a little bit now to talk in some specifics here about some of the threat agents. So when we think about threat agents and biological weapons, we kind of categorize them based on their severity or how much public health effort will be needed to stop them. And category A are the worst, and those are smallpox, tularemia, botulism, plague, anthrax, and the viral hemorrhagic fevers. Category B is a little broader, including things like ricin, melioidosis, glanders, Q fever. And most of these things have come from the Soviet biological weapons program. What were they weaponizing? That's basically how we made these categorizations. But what I think is interesting is not so much the actual agents, but what spurs government to take action when there's an infectious disease emergency, whether it's natural or whether it's deliberate. And that has to do with the concept of dread. The higher the population has dread, the higher the perceived unknown risk, that's going to serve as an impetus to decrease risk. Is this something that's going to disrupt society? Is it going to change people's behavior very quickly? What's the baseline that people are used to? All of that's going to spur people into action. So you say, well, why do they jump into action for COVID, but they don't jump into action for tuberculosis? Or why are certain things on the evening news and certain things aren't? It has to do with this idea of dread. Why do people who have brain-eating amoebas, the 10 cases that occur every year, why are those always headline news? It's because of the dread. It's not because it's actually the same public health threat as tuberculosis, for example, where there are 10,000 cases in the United States. It's because dread is what's motivating people. And it's really important to recognize that infrequent large losses of life, people are intolerant of that versus frequent small losses of life. Nobody keeps track of the number of people who from car accidents that happen every year. That's not what's going to motivate government action when it comes to a health security threat. It's infrequent large losses of life because they believe that will change behavior, undercut political order in a rapid or draconian fashion. That's what they're worried about. That's what will push them to consider something an emergency and something not an emergency. Things that are slow, things that are baked into people's risk perceptions, they don't, even if they take a bigger toll, are going to be less likely to spur action. So you think about Ebola in 2013, 2014, when we had some Ebola cases, that was headline news for weeks and weeks and weeks, even though the threat to the general public wasn't that high. There were bigger public health and infectious disease threats, but the dread factor was very high with the Ebola outbreak when we had those cases in Dallas. So some of the things that I've worked on, and I think this might be interesting to you, it kind of gives you a flavor of what health security is. I worked on topics related to the characteristics of pandemic pathogens, vaccine platform technologies, which we all saw come to fruition during COVID with the mRNA vaccine platform, at-home diagnostics. That was something I was pushing for long before COVID. That also came to fruition during COVID. Thinking about medical countermeasures against unknown unknowns, how public health interfaces with primary care, crisis standards of care, which you all probably experienced here in New York City during COVID, viral families, and I'll get into this in a little bit more detail, which viral families are the most likely to cause a pandemic, because we've got 25 viral families that can infect humans, but maybe only 6 or so that are pandemic prone. How do you prepare hospitals for all hazards, including a project I did here in New York City looking at how hospitals evacuated during Superstorm Sandy. I've worked on nuclear device response, immune modulators for infectious disease, another thing that came to fruition during COVID. And right now I'm also looking at how artificial intelligence may help us accelerate drugs and vaccines against biothreat agents. So that's a really broad overview of what health security does. But I'm going to go into the pandemic preparedness aspect of it, and just some basic definitions I think it's important to keep in mind. That a pandemic doesn't have to be very severe to cause major disruption. It just has to be a new infectious disease threat occurring over a wide area of the world, as distinct from an epidemic or an endemic disease. And I think it's really important to kind of situate this in the history of humans on the planet. That humans have basically been nomads for almost their entire time on this planet. And it was when agriculture was developed that started to increase population density, increase human-to-human interaction, gave us new problems with waste management, agriculture, lifestyle changes that occurred when people weren't moving around. And evolution hasn't had time to do that. If you look at that graph, you can see that for over 100,000 years, nomadic foraging. Once population density increases, that's when infectious diseases can take hold, where they can spread in crowds because there's enough people to infect. And that changes a lot of what was happening with humans in terms of disease. It's not a coincidence that when we get to the agricultural age, it's also known as the age of pestilence and famine, because so many diseases are now able to spread. And at that time, people thought it would be better to live in the countryside or away from cities, because in urban areas, that's where there was enough population density for these diseases to spread. Then you have the Industrial Revolution, which leads to the development of vaccines, the developments of antimicrobial treatments, and you have an age of receding epidemics. And now we're in an age of degenerative and man-made diseases. You think about in terms of how much immunosuppression goes on because modern medicine can do organ transplants, can do chemotherapy. That creates another infectious disease risk. And what we worry about when people are interacting with animals, agriculture, for example, is zoonotic spread. Most of our infectious diseases have some origin in an animal species. And I think it's, people have to really think hard about this, because not every animal disease has the ability to infect humans. We're exposed all the time to viruses from other species. Most of them are unable to infect us. Maybe some are able to infect us, but they don't really go anywhere. It's a one-off case. And then there's a smaller subset that are able to have limited transmission between person to person, and a very select group that can spread in an epidemic or pandemic fashion. So I think it's important to remember that when you're thinking about all these exotic viruses, most of them are not going to be able to cause a pandemic, even if they might end up causing a lot of panic. You want to work on the left side of this graph when you're seeing exposure in animals, exposure in humans, before you get to the fact where humans are now seeking medical care, where you've got a widespread outbreak, because the cost goes up exponentially. It is much cheaper to deal with these things at the source and to have preparedness activities done at the source. So maybe you have recommendations on how people should interact with animals, how people should sell animals in markets. That's much cheaper to do than to deal with COVID after it actually has jumped into humans and spread from person to person. So a lot of what I talk about is trying to be proactive, to set up programs where people are doing things ahead of time before you're in that exponential phase of cost. But this, I want to work on the left side of the chart. Politicians don't get engaged until the very right side of the chart, when that dread factor sets in. And that's why we're in this perennial problem when it comes to preparedness against health security threats. So the other thing to keep in mind is that it's a very small world, and I don't have to belabor this here in New York City, because you all know that. people can get from one part of the globe to the other part of the globe in 24 hours. And I think that's important because most incubation periods are going to be longer than that. And people's periods of contagiousness may begin after they get to their destination. And travel time continues to shrink. So in general, when travel time is less than the incubation period, you're going to see importation of disease. We're not in the era where people were on ships, where they got sick and recovered in that period of time when they were going on the ship, going across the oceans. Now people are going at the speed of a jetliner, and viruses are going at the speed of a jet, not at the speed of a steamship. And you can just, and we're in the shadow of JFK here, you know this as well as anybody, that the global flight map can get one person from one side of the planet to the other side within 24 hours. So in every hospital in the United States, for example, you have to be prepared to see diseases that you might not expect to see. The other thing that's also kind of integrating with this is the rise of megacities. Population density, more megacities, more chance for pathogens to spread. And that's why during the 2013-2014 West Africa Ebola outbreak, there was a major concern when there was an Ebola case in Nigeria, in Lagos, because they thought if this thing can spread in an urban environment, it may be catastrophic. However, Ebola is very constrained because it spreads through blood and body fluid, and the Nigerian public health authorities were very aggressive in stopping that spread. But the rise of megacities do pose a risk for infectious disease. You can just see where some of these megacities are also places where they're kind of the traditional hotspots for infectious disease emergence, where it is warmer, where there's more biodiversity in terms of the animal populations. That's very important for the underlying risk of a pathogen emerging. So one of the things I worked on was trying to drill down and understand, and I started doing this before COVID, what is it that can cause a pandemic? Because everybody would say, oh, anything new can cause, Ebola can cause a pandemic, Mpox can cause a pandemic. But is it actually true? What would a pathogen have to have? And this is kind of what I boiled it down to. Number one, efficient transmissibility from human to human. You have to be able to spread. So that will take out certain pathogens because they don't spread efficiently. You don't need to have a high fatality rate. COVID's fatality rate was less than 1%, yet it killed millions and millions of people around the world. And this I put in bold is the most important characteristic of a pandemic pathogen. It needs to be contagious during the incubation period. If someone is able to go about their activities of daily living and interact with people and be contagious, that's going to make it almost impossible to control because you won't know who is spreading and who is not. You're not going to be able to distinguish that person because they're in the incubation period. And the same is also true for mild illness. If someone can go about their activities of daily living, like you can with COVID, like you can with influenza, that's a pandemic pathogen. The population should be immunologically naive, meaning they haven't seen anything, so there's a huge pool of susceptible hosts, no off-the-shelf vaccine or treatment, and some evasion of the host immune response. So that's sort of what you need to boil into a pandemic pathogen, which will help you focus or help policymakers focus on the pathogens that actually matter when they're thinking about developing vaccines and medical countermeasures like antivirals ahead of time. And I put this all in this report, which is the thing that I'm most proud of that I worked on, was this report that I put together on this prior to COVID, which in that report I talk about coronaviruses as well, which which made people a little bit weirded out that we were predicting a coronavirus pandemic and then we had one, but that's part of the conspiracy theory world we live in. But what I was really trying to do was move away from list-based historical approach. I wanted to have this inductive foundation and use that paradigm to move forward and think, well, there's a new virus that's discovered, or there's a new outbreak. Is this going to have pandemic potential? And then change preparedness activities in a proactive way based on those findings. And I wanted to be totally microbe agnostic. So I came up with those criteria. So I said, what has those criteria? And I'm going to think, I'm going to start with bacteria, viruses, protozoa, helminths, prions, all of it. I wanted to say, I'm just going to be completely agnostic. And I really centered on respiratory viruses because they meet all those criteria in a way that no other pathogen does. And when you think about the respiratory viruses, there's really 6 or so families that I think are the ones that we need to focus on for pandemic threats. And these should not be surprising to you. You all have seen them and thought through them. Obviously, orthomyxoviruses, which include influenza, including avian strains, the coronaviruses, which don't need to be talked about, paramyxoviruses, which include things like measles, but also Hendra, Nipah, parainfluenza as well. Pneumoviridae, which sort of is a new family, which includes RSV and metapneumovirus. The picoRNA viruses, which include enteroviruses, including polio, and rhinoviruses, and the adenoviruses as well. I think that's where I think our pandemic threats are going to come from. And it's not necessarily going to be Nipah virus causing a pandemic. There was a Nipah virus scare a couple of weeks ago when there were some cases that occurred in India, and some countries instituted travel bans. I don't necessarily think it's going to be Nipah. Nipah's been around for a while. It hasn't been able to transmit efficiently between humans, but I think it's going to be something adjacent to Nipah. Just like if you think about SARS-CoV-1, which was the first coronavirus that caused a major bioemergency, it was not able to cause a pandemic, but something just adjacent to it in an animal species, SARS-CoV-2, could. So I think it's going to be something that is a zoonotic member of one of these respiratory viral families. So not human influenza, but avian influenza or swine influenza, for example. And if you look at the story of metapneumovirus, for those who are interested, that is a fully zoonotic virus that jumped from turkeys into humans. And you can do things to try and understand. The receptor binding is really going to be really important. Not everything is going to be able to infect humans. So I think it's really, you have to actually drill into, can this thing infect humans? So you see these news stories about, they find some virus in the permafrost. The first question to ask is, does this receptor actually bind to human cells? That's the first thing, is have the ability to bind to mammalian cells. And a lot of that gets left out of some of the way people characterize these threats. One of the things that we did that was really interesting just prior to COVID was we did a pandemic exercise, Clade. And if you look it up on conspiracy websites, you'll find a lot of craziness there. But what it was an exercise where top level, like former CDC directors, former people in the intelligence community, and we staged a tabletop exercise, ironically funded by the Gates Foundation and the World Economic Forum, but in Washington, where we proposed a pandemic caused by zoonotic coronavirus. And that was something that we did prior to COVID, because we had identified coronaviruses as a pandemic threat after SARS-CoV-1 and after MERS. And we did this big threat, trying to get people engaged, trying to get people to be proactive, but it eventually ended up kind of fodder for the tabloids. And there's a picture of me at Clade talking, and then there's a picture of me in the National Enquirer afterwards, so on the right side of the thing. So this is the world we live in, where things that you do can get distorted through this filter now that we live in of misinformation and institutional distrust. So one of the things that I talked about is proactivity. And if you go back to the pandemic prior to COVID-19, that's H1N1, 2009. I was in training at that time. I was in between my ID and my critical care years. And look at H1N1, for those of you who don't remember, if you look at it, the peak of cases occurred in September to October of 2009, and I can remember how bad it was in the ICU. Not COVID bad, but bad at that state for that stage. And you can look when vaccine doses were shipped. They missed the peak with the vaccine. That's the opposite of proactivity. That's reactivity, and that has to do with the fact that we're using egg-based flu vaccines, that they're hard to grow. This particular virus is hard to grow, but the vaccine was less impactful. So think about the COVID vaccines and how much better that timing was. That's what proactivity is, or that's not even proactive enough, but that's a much more rapid response where the vaccine was able to impact the trajectory. But this is what we're trying to avoid, is this type of a repeat where vaccine and countermeasures become available when it's too late and you don't get the full benefit from it. And there's my vaccination for H1N1. People thought that it was the first time you ever had vaccine cards with COVID. There's my little vaccine card from the health department in Allegheny County, where Pittsburgh is. And you can see when I got that was November 21st, 2009, well after the peak. So how do you get proactive? And this is another project I work on involving vaccine platform technologies. So what is a platform? The best way to think about this is, for those of you who when I grew up in the 1980s, we had game consoles. We had like Atari, Nintendo, Sega. That's the platform, and we would switch out Super Mario Brothers for Legend of Zelda or Adventure of Link or whatever it might be. That's plug and play. Or the space shuttle. Space shuttle Atlantis goes up, it has a different payload each time. The space shuttle is the platform, the payload is what varies. That's what platform technologies can do. So if you think, for example, about the Johnson & Johnson COVID vaccine, it used an adenovirus with the COVID spike protein in it. That's a platform. Or the mRNA vaccines, where they can just basically flip out the genetic code and you've got a platform. You can just plug and play. That's being proactive. That decreases the speed, decreases the time to need for a vaccine to be developed. And I think that this really came to fruition around COVID. And I did a big project before that, talking about the fact that when you think about an infectious disease emergency, vaccination is going to have the major role in diminishing the intensity and spread of the infectious disease. And the time to develop vaccine is going to be the rate limiting step. We used to watch that movie Contagion, and you have the vaccine going into people's arms by the time the credits roll. We thought that was not feasible, but it actually is with mRNA vaccine technologies. So vaccine platforms are a way to basically revolutionize the way we think about infectious disease threats. And I do think that mRNA and DNA vaccines are probably the perfect platform, even if they are now the subject of ire from the federal government, because they're able to be modified very quickly, they have a very short lead time, and they will revolutionize the way we respond to pandemics. And there are other platforms as well. So some of you might have heard of the flu vaccine Flublok or the Novavax COVID vaccine. Both of those use interesting platforms as well, using insect cells and insect viruses to develop recombinant proteins. Those also are very quick in terms of needing to be being able to be updated on the fly. So I think we're getting to that point where we have the technology, but at the same time, the politics has turned away from this technology. The other project I worked on that I think came to fruition during COVID was at-home diagnostics. It took about a decade to get an at-home HIV test, and there was a lot of reticence about using at-home influenza tests, and they were starting to look at them prior to COVID. In 2018, 2019, there was funding, companies were developing them, but there was a lot of skepticism about whether people could do it. During COVID, everybody started using home tests, and now we have home tests for not just HIV and COVID, but influenza, RSV, certain sexually transmitted infections. So I think this is something that is going to only accelerate. We had smart thermometers before, and that I think that's kind of the poor version of that, where these thermometers were linked on the network, and you could tell when COVID was in a city, all these people with smart thermometers were taking their temperature a lot. But imagine if you had a toaster-like device in your kitchen, where you could swab yourself and it will tell you, you have group A strep, or you have RSV, you have influenza, and it links you to a telemedicine prescription for an antiviral for flu or COVID or antibiotics, or it tells you what to do. I think that's where we could eventually end up. And there's no technological limitation to this. I think it's just the policies being put in place. And you can imagine if a lot of people in a city have these types of devices, and they're all testing themselves, and they're all coming up negative for like 15 different things, but they're all sick. Isn't that a great public health signal that you might have, that something odd is going on in that city? These people tested themselves for all these things, it's negative. Now we need to investigate. That's an early warning system that I think there's no technological barrier to having at this point. I'm going to talk a little bit about bird flu because it's one of the major infectious disease threats that we face. And this has been something that's been going on for a very long time. Bird flu viruses circulate naturally in birds. That's the natural reservoir in these shorebirds. And humans can get into that cycle, as can swine and domestic birds. But we've been having multiple different bird flu appearances over time. And you can see they go back all the way to the 1950s, and 1918 was a wholly avian virus. So this is one of our biggest threats that we face. But the obstacle that bird flu viruses face is that they can't infect us very well because the receptors they bind to are not present in our upper respiratory tract. They're present in our lower respiratory tract. So it's much harder for them to get to infect us because they have to infect through our nose and through our mouth. Whereas in birds, that receptor is present all throughout. So that's one of the things we look for is it changing its receptor binding preference? Is it recombining with seasonal flu viruses in order to get that preference? But that's what we're looking at. And I think H5N1 is an important thing to know. It's been around since 1997, but in 2002, we were seeing major outbreaks in poultry, which were then spilling into mammalian populations. Sea mammals, foxes, cats, bears, skunks, lots of things. And remember, humans are mammals too. So when something is able to infect mammals, that is a sign that this virus is getting closer to being able to infect humans and cause a pandemic. And what we've seen is it has been able to spread prolifically in certain mammalian species, but not so much in humans. And then something interesting happened. It ended up in cows. Cows are not a normal host of influenza viruses, except for influenza D. And cows don't even get respiratory illness with influenza. They basically had diminished milk production. And basically what happened was people decided to test because there was poultry outbreaks, and they found it in cows, they found it in the milk, and then we started to get cases in individuals who were milking those cows who were getting primarily conjunctivitis. And we were finding it in unpasteurized milk, which incidentally is the favorite kind of milk of our health secretary. And multiple human cases did occur that were severe, but we have not seen this kind of spread. But I would say today we're really in the dark about what's going on, because many of these programs are not really transparent what they're doing, what they're looking for, and cows are a major economic commodity, and there's a lot of hesitancy to do this type of testing on farms, and especially in the current environment, many of the workers on farms don't want to be tested because of the implications of testing positive, or the implications of it. Actually, many of them are not documented. That makes it very hard for us to get a handle on what's going on farms. We do have avian influenza vaccines that have been stockpiled since the 2000s. There were contracts for new and better matched strains, including an mRNA version from Moderna, which was, not surprisingly, canceled by the current administration. We've had a bunch of new vaccines that have developed. I don't need to spend much time. I just put them on there kind of to tell you that there is still work going on in vaccines that it's exciting, from chikungunya to next generation COVID vaccines to self-administered flu vaccines like FluMist. And just a little, there is a next generation COVID vaccine. You probably all know about it. It's called mNEXSpike, which might be better in older age groups. So there is innovation still going on. I wanted to kind of sort of end the talk talking about what's on everybody's mind when it comes to infectious disease and health, and that's the return of the primitive, which means turning our back on these technologies that I've kind of talked about through the beginning of this talk, and going to a time when diseases that were not endemic become endemic, such as measles. And what I'm referring to here is the rise of the anti-vaccine movement. And I think that we're in this kind of conundrum of how to actually handle them. Because people always say, just educate people and they will get it. But that's not necessarily the case. There's multiple studies that show the more you educate someone who is anti-vaccine, the more anti-vaccine they become. And I think the pandemic shows the danger of the anti-vaccine movement, where people's stance on vaccines led them to die. And you could look at vaccine uptake and political affiliation. It's really striking how much of an impact that had in the pandemic. And anti-vaccine sentiment metastasized from COVID vaccines to flu vaccines to hepatitis B vaccines to measles vaccines to pertussis vaccines, even to veterinary vaccines. Veterinary vaccine levels are down as well. So there's a major issue that we're facing where people are just turning away from what seems to probably everybody in this crowd, an unequivocal beneficial technology. And when you really drill into it, a lot of people will say, and I'm not a philosopher, but I've been trying to study how the anti-vaccine movement talks and thinks about these things. A lot of them will say, it's not knowable, objective facts aren't knowable. They don't like these grand meta-narratives. When I say grand narrative, a grand narrative means the germ theory of disease. They don't like the idea that you can figure things out. They think that science is this big meta-narrative that led to pollution and nuclear weapons, and that they put the pharmaceutical industry and the biotech industry in that same group, and they just think this is all not something that's for them, and it's not true to them, and that science creates civilizational risks, so they're not going to be part of the solution. That's when you think deeply about how the anti-vaccine movement operates, when you really drill into their leaders and what they're saying, this is sort of what they're saying, that they're anti-science all the way down. And they'll often say, when I argue with some anti-vaccine people, say, well, you're just saying that because you're a doctor. So that's true from your standpoint, but not true from mine. You remember during, in the old anti-vaccine era, one of these anti-vaccine celebrities said, well, I don't need science, my son is my science. So these local narratives, these stories that they hear about a child having autism or a child dying of sudden infant death syndrome, that's more important than actually the causal mechanism, if it actually even exists. And now the anti-vaccine movement is infused with identity politics, that you can predict someone's stance on vaccines by their political registration. They don't believe that experts are a source of truth. They don't see the scientific method as better. They think it's just one cultural approach among many. And they think of science now as a branch office for politics in the garb of numbers. And that's this expert disdain that you're seeing, which is really, really difficult to counter. They have these alternative models of truth. Their version of information is what we would call misinformation or disinformation. They suspect expertise. Do your own research, they say. Their values are what's determining whether an opinion is worth holding. So whether or not they think vaccines are something that are beneficial for their children, that's going to derive from their kind of upstream values. They're not looking at the vaccine as a tool to help their child get through life where there's infectious disease threats. And I think this is really scary because what we're doing to combat them isn't really working that much, and that's why we have record numbers of measles cases, for example. And I think that one of the things that I always say is that, there's some really great papers in Vaccine in 2012 that talk about this, that the minds of the deeply invested anti-vaccine activists may never be changed. And I think what you really need to focus on are those people that are kind of in between, that are sort of getting lured into the anti-vaccine movement, they haven't quite committed, and provide them not necessarily with fact sheets about the tetanus shot, but how to actually think about these concepts. Give them some skills to think critically about what they're being faced with. And I think it's going to be a major challenge that we face with the resurgence of measles, with the resurgence of pertussis. And if we were to have a biothreat agent emerge now, we would not see Operation Warp Speed again. We would see the opposite of whatever warp is. And I think it's now become a culture. These are some headlines. They talk about it being a culture where if you talk about science, that you're going against their political identity. That becomes very hard. When people are tribalist about this type of thing, which they should have no reason to be tribalist about, it is very hard to dissuade them and persuade them when it's now become part of their identity. Because if you're attacking their identity, then they're not going to be receptive to it. And recently, the Pfizer CEO said, it's like talking to people about religion. You cannot dissuade them on the vaccine thing. That's what the CEO of Pfizer was saying, trying to deal with the new administration and their anti-vaccine advocates. So I've given you a little bit of a whirlwind tour of biosecurity, health security, and the work I do. I think in the remaining time, I'm happy to take questions on any infectious disease topic. I ended with my own little health and immunization record there. You can see how old I am, and it looks like I got the MMR separately back then, because that might have been what was available where I was. But these are some of the vaccines, and you can see there's only like 5 there. And that's in the 1970s and 1980s. So much more now that children have. They're basically like billion-dollar kids because they've got protection against so many different things. I was just didn't have my varicella shot, and none of that stuff was there. But thank you for your attention. I hope that was interesting. Hopefully it was a little different than what you get in your normal grand rounds, and I'm happy to take questions, and thanks for your attention. I think that, and I was one of the people advocating for more nuanced messaging and teaching people about risk communication and how to risk stratify. But what was happening from Washington and from the state capitals was basically one-size-fits-all solutions. They didn't want any nuance. They didn't want to say, well, hybrid immunity does have there are some benefits to hybrid immunity, or someone who had COVID is less likely to have a severe case of COVID. They didn't want to say that. They wanted it all to be very easy, very, compact snippets. When I was a kid in the 1980s, we grew up during the nuclear age, and we used to have this saying, duck and cover. That's what you would do if there was a nuclear attack. You'd hide under your desk. That's what they were looking for COVID. But there wasn't something like that with COVID. And when they give these pronouncements that were basically very kind of abstinence-only type of thing, to treat the outdoors the same as the indoors, everyone has the same risk, that people realized that wasn't true, and it created distrust. And I think if you read now some of the work some of the writing that some of the COVID teams the teams at the White House were working on, they actually recognized that. They knew that they were giving they weren't giving nuanced information, but they did it in terms of simplicity because they thought it would confuse the public. But in the end, that created more distrust. And I think what you want to do is tell people what you know, what you don't know, what questions you're going to ask, and when you're going to have the answers to those questions. That's what you need to say, and you have to not have this temptation to use a one-size-fits-all solution because it's convenient. It's easier just to say everybody does this, or everybody gets this, or everything is the same, when people can really see with their own eyes that it's not. And that's what we're facing now. And we may never get that trust back. I think that when you think about lockdowns, you have to kind of situate us in the whole context. So let's think about the United States. So COVID first jumps into humans probably in November of 2019 in China. We're notified about it December 31st, 2019, the WHO is notified. Everybody in the United States quickly understands, at least in the infectious disease community, this is a efficiently spreading novel coronavirus and that it's going to be able to cause a pandemic. But in the United States, they ignored it from January, February, half of March. And by that time, here in New York City, cases had bubbled up and were crushing hospital capacity, already causing major disruption in certain cities. And you had governors, mayors who had no other tools left because January, February, half of March, we didn't do anything. Were we able to test? No. Could we tell who was contagious? No. Did we have personal protective equipment? No. Did we have nursing homes fortified, even though we knew the elderly were particularly at risk? No. We didn't do anything. So what ended up happening is governors, mayors had very blunt tools, and they used the blunt tools because they didn't want to be blamed for anybody dying, and they were privileging the short term over the long term. They weren't thinking what's going to happen to the economy, what's going to happen to cancer screenings, what's going to happen to heart attacks, what's going to happen to children's education. They just needed to fix the problem as quickly as possible, or at least what they thought, and they weren't thinking long range. So what you really ideally would have done is something like Taiwan or South Korea did, where as soon as they had a threat, they knew there was a threat. They developed the ability to test, trace, and isolate. We never had that. By March of 2020, South Korea was testing like 3,000 people a day for COVID. United States, we were testing 300 per week. Our president said, the more we test, the worse we look. Why should we test? We had restrictive testing criteria where you could only test people if they had been to Wuhan and if they had lower respiratory tract infections. So someone who came from Wuhan and had a sore throat was ineligible to be tested. The test turnaround was probably 7 days at some times. Only state health departments and CDC could do it. They made it very hard for tests to be made and manufactured, like laboratory developed tests. They basically blocked that pathway. They made a concerted effort not to test. So you have to think, the lockdowns came because they screwed up so bad that they thought that was the only tool, and they did not think about it in a long-term fashion, and we're paying the price for that, because even with that policy, the United States number of deaths is astronomical. And I think that the model should be South Korea, Taiwan, proactivity. So I think that they should have been much more targeted based on testing, and they should have incorporated things like, outdoors versus indoors. And that would have made a lot more sense to people. They would have been more likely to self-isolate. They would have had more trust. But I think that whole policy was a major failure. Technologically speaking, yes, we are. But politically prepared? No, not at all. Look who is in charge of the Department of Health and Human Services. We are not prepared for a pandemic. If you could have the best toolbox in the world, the best minds, but if you don't use those toolbox, or if you think that toolbox is all poison, you're going to be worse off. So no, I think we are worse off than we are in 2026. We are worse off than we are in 2019, not because of the science, but because of who is in charge now. There's not a leader at the CDC right now. There's no CDC director. We have an HHS secretary who doesn't believe in the germ theory of disease, who is the most ardent anti-vaccine advocate in modern history. And we have basically the recipe for something horrible to happen if we are faced with some kind of threat. And you have a general population that completely distrusts infectious disease physicians, public health authorities. So no, I don't have any hope that anything good would happen. And I think it would be a disaster if we were faced with an infectious disease emergency. So this is one of the rising threats, and there are multiple groups looking at AI threats to human health, misuse of AI data, as well as at my center, at the Center for Health Security, there is a group of people that are working on the issue of AI making it easier to develop biological weapons or to make biothreats. So there are people that are looking at the other side of AI. So like any technology, AI can be used for good or it can be used for evil. And there is a concerted effort to try and understand how to fortify our risks against AI and misuse of biological data, as well as using AI to develop biological weapons. There are major major efforts underway right now to do that. So it isn't something that's being neglected. It is a hard and challenging problem because you have to strike this balance, because AI can be such a force for good, but on the same side, it can be used, it can be misused. So it's a very precarious balance you have to put in place so that you're not discouraging productive, good use of AI, and at the same time, not facilitating bad use of AI. So it is a very challenging problem. Yes, there are lots of people working on it. For physicians, AI can be a great tool to help you with diagnosis. It helps with electronic medical records. You're figuring out sepsis. So I think there's a big reason to embrace AI in the use of clinical medicine. But I think that you have to make sure you're working with operators that make sense, that are not, fronts for the Chinese government, for example. That's been one threat that we've uncovered, and that when you're doing projects relating to AI, asking questions about the data security. Where are the servers? Who has access to them? How is the access regulated? All of those are important questions to ask when you're using AI or when your patients are using AI tools. So great questions. And I left out my antimicrobial resistance work, but yes, antimicrobial resistance is a potential global catastrophic biological risk. It threatens to pull medicine back to the pre-penicillin era. And it is something that is a very hard problem to solve and is often neglected because it doesn't cause the same societal dread as Ebola does. And it is silent because of the individuals who die from drug-resistant infections are not necessarily the people that garner a lot of attention. There are definitely efforts underway. One thing that I would mention from an economic perspective is something called the Pasteur Act that the Infectious Disease Society of America has been advocating for. So what happens is drug companies make an antibiotic, a very fancy new antibiotic, and it works on drug-resistant bacteria, but it's restricted in its use. So they never can recoup their investment because their revenue is dependent upon the volume of sales. But if we've got some great drug that works against CRE, we don't want it used against garden variety E. coli. So there's been efforts to make something called the Netflix model, where Netflix, you subscribe, you can watch Indiana Jones as many times as you want. You don't get charged each time. So you can have a subscription model where a hospital system could subscribe to, for example, XYZ pharmaceutical company's antimicrobial portfolio, and they pay a set fee, and they decide when they use it. But the pharmaceutical company makes a return on investment. They've already done this in the United Kingdom. There are certain jails that have done it with hepatitis C drugs. So there is an effort. The Pasteur Act has been reintroduced into Congress in a bipartisan fashion, and IDSA has been pushing for this, and it is something to look up as a way to fix this economic problem with getting new drugs for these bad bugs. Bacteriophages and other antimicrobial alternatives, I did a major project for BARDA on that, and I published it in CID, in Clinical Infectious Disease. I do think that bacteriophages and other types of compounds that are not antibiotics are part of the solution. I practice at the University of Pittsburgh, where we do use phages in patients with cystic fibrosis, for example. So phages are something that may be a way to help us get through this antimicrobial resistance nightmare that most of us are facing on a day-to-day basis when we practice. Phages are now, there used to not be an easy regulatory pathway. That regulatory pathway has basically been made open, and I do think we will likely see more and more phage therapies used for resistant infections. There's some really great books that have been written about phages, one called The Good Virus, and I think one by a microbiologist named Stephanie Strathedy that I recommend to introduce you to the concept of phages. But yes, I do think that phages are one way to combat antimicrobial resistance, which is often neglected and is part of health security. I just omitted it from this talk. It's completely haphazard what's going on now, and it's completely been ruined. All of the public health infrastructure, the agencies that you deal with on a day-to-day basis, most of us have lost trust in them because they are all under the aegis of RFK Jr., who is anti-vaccine zealot. So the CDC, the NIH, the FDA, all of those organizations are now controlled by RFK Jr., and whoever he puts in charge is not likely to be amenable to rational thought on these issues. So it's completely disrupted the entire structure of health security. And as I said earlier, we are very worried about what might happen if there's even a minor infectious disease emergency right now that requires a national response, because we don't have people that actually could execute it or even actually believe in the tools that would be necessary to do that. And we have a general population that completely distrusts anything to do with infectious disease, and now has good reason to distrust the CDC, the FDA, and NIH because of what's happened to them. So he has dismantled, RFK Jr. has dismantled the whole infectious disease preparedness architecture in this country. So I think from that standpoint, most of us are very alarmed about what might happen if we're called upon for a national response to some infectious disease emergency, and we don't know how we're going to build all of this back up when this passes. How will the CDC reconstitute itself? How will they regain the trust? I think these are all questions that don't have easy answers, but I would say that the entire industry the whole industry around biosecurity, health security is in shambles right now because of, and it's done deliberately. It wasn't from neglect, this is a deliberate move by the leaders of health and human services at this point.